This is The Secret Life of Ronald Reagan. Things you might not know about America's 40th president. Ronald Wilson Reagan was born in Tampico, Illinois, on February 6, 1911. He grew up in the Midwest during the Great Depression, became a college athlete, a radio sports announcer, a Hollywood movie star, head of the Screen Actors Guild, governor of California, and president of the United States. All these facts are in the public record. But what is not so well known about Ronald Reagan? Let's take a look behind the scenes. This podcast is brought to you by Clear Brush Productions, which presents a one-man show called Ronald Reagan Saves the World. I'm Terry Phillips, playwright and producer. For more information about the show, visit our website, reaganplay.com. Episode 3 in this podcast series is called Reagan and Alzheimer's Disease. As you might know, after leaving the White House, President Reagan wrote an open letter to the American people disclosing that he had been diagnosed with this condition. That was on November 5, 1994. But 10 years earlier, in 1984, he recorded the following public service announcement.
Few Americans have heard of Alzheimer's disease, but for more than 1.5 million Americans, its devastating effects are all too real. Alzheimer's disease is the most common cause of intellectual impairment in older Americans. This killer of mind and life has gone virtually undetected, and the families of its victims have gone unaided. You can help. Public awareness and research are the first steps in the battle against this cruel disease, and if you need help, call your local Alzheimer's Disease Association. Thank you.
Since that time, nearly 4 decades ago, the number of Americans affected by Alzheimer's disease has skyrocketed. In a moment, I'll speak with an expert on this subject. But first, let's address the elephant in the room. Did Ronald Reagan have Alzheimer's while he was president? That's the secret we'll explore later in this podcast. My one-man show, Ronald Reagan Saves the World, is presented in part as a benefit to the Alzheimer's Association. We donate a portion of all proceeds to that important organization, and I encourage you to support them as well. There's a link to their website in the show notes, or you can visit alz.org. Jeannie West is a senior care consultant in Santa Barbara, California. She uses her knowledge, experience, and connections in the community to help individuals and families deal with Alzheimer's. Jeannie, what is Alzheimer's disease?
Simply stated, I'm going to say it's a disease that affects the nerve cells of the brain. It's a degenerative disease that can strike middle age or old age. We tend to see it more as people get older. And this affects thinking, memory, and behavior.
How does a person know if she or he has Alzheimer's?
It's difficult to diagnose and oftentimes challenging to treat because there's no standard uniform set of symptoms that everybody's going to show at a particular time.
Let's talk about the larger topic of dementia. I occasionally have trouble remembering things. When does forgetfulness become something to worry about?
So when we start forgetting things that are pretty routine and characteristic in our lives, how to eat, how to drive, how to write checks and pay bills. There are many kinds or many reasons for dementia. Alzheimer's is the most common one.
Of course, we all tend to forget things as we age. That's not necessarily an indication of dementia, right?
We tend to excuse the changes that we see and make a reason why that might be happening. Oh, he's tired, or oh, it was a bad day at work, or whatever. And it usually takes something pretty dramatic to call attention to the fact something is really wrong here.
Dementia does occur more often in the older population. Statistically, 1 out of every 2 or 3 people over the age of 85 is likely to develop some form of memory loss.
Could be because they had many strokes And so areas of the brain where those clots hit, the cells die, and therefore they're not functioning.
Jeannie, what don't we know about Alzheimer's disease?
How to treat it. Is everyone going to develop this? Not everyone, but the numbers get higher.
And that's in no small part because we're living longer. So, until and unless a treatment comes along, how do we help our loved ones cope with Alzheimer's?
No matter what your educational background, your training, your spiritual, emotional philosophy is, it is very draining to see the person that you love lose abilities that we so commonly take for granted. You have to fill in those gaps where the memory is gone and do a lot of coaching. But more than that, you have to reassure that person. So treating the person with dignity is so important.
That's Jeannie West. In addition to providing funds for research, the Alzheimer's Association gives free support to individuals and families affected by this disease. You can call the helpline 24 hours a day, toll-free, 800-272-3900. So, did Ronald Reagan have Alzheimer's during his presidency? There are many conflicting opinions on this question. While I could find no concrete evidence or clinical diagnosis proving he had the disease in the White House, most scientists say Alzheimer's begins slowly and develops over time. While we will probably never know exactly if or how much the condition affected America's 40th president while he was in office, there can be little doubt that the stresses of his job, along with the man's age, made it likely he had some memory loss and other related symptoms. On the other hand, all that was probably minimized by the former actor's skills and experience as a performer. In 2 of his last public appearances, Reagan still managed to deliver speeches fluidly, with poise, great timing, and yes, that characteristic self-deprecating sense of humor.
And Mr. Chairman, delegates, friends, fellow Americans, thank you so very much for that welcome.
Here he is speaking at the 1992 Republican National Convention in Houston, Texas.
You've given Nancy and me so many wonderful memories, so much of your warmth and affection. We cannot thank you enough for the honor of your friendship.
Reagan's final public speech was at the RNC gala in Washington, just 9 months before he revealed the Alzheimer's diagnosis.
I don't think an event of this kind would be complete without, well, something that you probably got used to during my days in Washington. One of my stories. It's a story about a woman who walked into a bridal shop one day and told the sales clerk that she was looking for a wedding gown for her 4th wedding. Well, the saleswoman asked, "Just exactly what type of dress are you looking for?" "A long, flowing white dress with a veil," she responded with assurance. Not totally convinced, but afraid to offend the woman, the saleslady said, "You know, dresses of that nature are usually more appropriate for brides who are being married for the first time, for those a bit more innocent, if you know what I mean." Well, the lady retorted and put her hand on her hip. "I do know what you mean, and I can assure you I'm as innocent as the rest of them. Despite all my marriages, I remain as innocent as any first-time bride." Well, you see, my first husband was a dear, sweet man. It was a terrible tragedy, actually. All the excitement of the wedding was simply too much for him, and he died as we checked into the hotel on our wedding night. "I'm sorry to hear that," said the clerk, "but what about the others?" Well, my second husband and I got into a terrible fight in the limousine on the way to our wedding reception. We haven't spoken since and got the marriage quickly annulled. "What about your third husband?" asked the store clerk. "Well," the woman replied, "he was a Democrat." And every night for 4 years, he just sat on the edge of the bed and told me how good it was going to be. Sorry, I just couldn't resist telling you.
You'll find a link to both speeches in the show notes, and you'll see some of his favorite stories in my new one-man show. Speaking of which, this podcast is brought to you by Clear Brush Productions, which presents Ronald Reagan Saves the World. For more information about the show, visit our website, reaganplay.com. Thanks for listening. I hope you'll join us again for The Secret Life of Ronald Reagan. And when is the next episode? Well, that's a secret. I'm Terry Phillips. Bye for now.